Welcome, everyone. I want you to imagine it's 1924. You're a factory worker in Cicero, Illinois. One day, researchers walk in and start watching you work. Suddenly, you're not just assembling relays anymore, you're performing. And without anyone telling you to work harder, your productivity climbs. That strange, almost magical effect is what we're here to explore today. It's called the Hawthorne Effect, and nearly a century later, it still has profound implications for how we design workplaces, run experiments, and even manage teams. Let's dive in. Here's our roadmap. First, we'll travel back to 1920s Chicago and the Western Electric Hawthorne Works, the birthplace of this phenomenon. Then we'll walk through the experiments themselves, the lighting studies, the relay assembly room, the interview program. After that, we'll unpack the core psychological mechanism, why simply being observed changes how we act. From there, we'll explore real-world manifestations in modern workplaces and research settings. But this isn't an unquestioned orthodoxy. We'll also examine the sharp critiques and controversies. And finally, we'll extract the practical lessons for anyone who designs research or leads people. 6 chapters that build toward a single, powerful conclusion. Let's rewind the clock to 1924. The Western Electric Company's Hawthorne Works in Cicero, Illinois, was a massive industrial complex employing tens of thousands of workers. At the time, industrial efficiency was dominated by Frederick Taylor's scientific management, the idea that you could engineer productivity through physical conditions. So when the company partnered with Harvard researchers to study the effect of lighting levels on worker output, everyone expected a straightforward result: better lighting, better productivity. What they got instead was far stranger and far more important. The origins of the Hawthorne effect lie in that unexpected gap between what should have happened and what actually did. The studies unfolded in distinct phases over nearly a decade. In 1924, the illumination experiments kicked things off. Researchers varied the lighting and watched what happened. By 1927, the focus shifted to the relay assembly test room, where 6 female workers were separated from the main factory floor and given different working conditions. In 1928, the researchers launched an ambitious interview program collecting over 20,000 worker interviews. By 1931, the bank wiring observation room was studying group dynamics and informal social norms. When Harvard's Elton Mayo published the findings in the early 1930s, the field of industrial sociology was effectively born. Notice the arc. It started with light bulbs and ended by revealing an entire hidden layer of human motivation. Take a moment to appreciate the sheer scale of this place. Over 40,000 workers. It was essentially a small city devoted to manufacturing telephone equipment. The factory had its own power plant, hospital, fire brigade, and even a recreation center. This scale is important because it meant the researchers could isolate groups, create controlled conditions, and run experiments that would be impossible in a smaller setting. But here's the irony. The very act of creating this laboratory environment, pulling workers aside, giving them special attention, may have been the most powerful variable in the entire study. The factory's size enabled the research, but the research itself transformed the workers. Here's where the story gets strange. The illumination experiments were designed to be straightforward. Turn up the lights, productivity goes up. Turn them down, it goes down. Instead, productivity kept climbing no matter what they did. They dimmed the lights to levels comparable to moonlight. Output still rose. And perhaps most baffling of all, the control group, whose lighting never changed, also improved. The researchers realized something was happening that their experimental design couldn't account for. The workers weren't responding to the light. They were responding to the attention. This was the first glimpse of the Hawthorne effect, and it completely upended the assumptions of scientific management. So what was really going on? After the illumination experiments, the researchers moved to the relay assembly test room. They gave workers different rest break schedules, shorter hours, refreshments. Each change seemed to boost productivity. But then, when they removed all the perks and returned to original conditions, productivity stayed high. The insight landed like a thunderbolt. The novelty, the sense of being chosen, the continuous observation by researchers. These social and psychological factors were more powerful than any physical change to the work environment. The workers felt important because someone was paying attention to them, and that feeling itself drove performance. This is the heart of the Hawthorne Effect. This is H.M. Parsons' definition from 1974, and I find it sharper than the more commonly cited version. Let me read it again. The confounding that occurs if experimenters fail to realize how the consequences of subjects' performance affect what subjects do. Parsons is making a subtler point than people work harder when watched. He's saying that being in an experiment creates a feedback loop. Subjects learn, they adapt, they try to figure out what the researcher wants, and they adjust their behavior accordingly. The experiment itself becomes a social situation, a performance, and the data you collect is contaminated by that performance in ways you may never fully untangle. That's the real methodological problem. Let's bring this into the present. Imagine a hospital running a hand hygiene compliance study. They station observers to record whether staff wash their hands. Compliance shoots up from 50% to nearly 90%. But is that real change, or is it the Hawthorne effect? Now think about classroom research. A study sends observers into schools to measure student engagement. The teacher, knowing she's being evaluated, brings her absolute best lesson plan. The students, sensing the visitors, sit up straighter. Are you measuring typical behavior or performance? This is the Hawthorne effect in action today, and it's a fundamental challenge for anyone who collects data through observation. The act of measuring changes the thing being measured. I want to draw a critical distinction because these two concepts are often confused. On the left, the Hawthorne effect. The subject actually changes their behavior because they know they're being watched. The behavior itself is different. On the right, observer bias. The subject's behavior may be unchanged, but the researcher's recording of it is distorted by their expectations. Both threaten validity, but they operate at different points in the research process. In the Hawthorne studies, both were probably at play, the workers performed differently, and the researchers were invested in finding productivity improvements. Understanding this distinction is essential for anyone who designs or consumes research. Which one is contaminating your data? Now let's pivot to the uncomfortable part of this story. For decades, the Hawthorne effect has been taught as established fact in psychology, management, and sociology courses. But in recent years, scholars have gone back to the original data, re-examined the experimental designs, and asked some devastating questions. What they found has cast serious doubt on the narrative we've all been told. The story of the Hawthorne effect may itself be a kind of myth, a compelling tale that we've repeated so often, we've stopped checking whether it's true. Let me walk you through the main criticisms. First, when researchers reanalyzed the original data decades later, they found that the clean productivity curves we see in textbooks simply don't exist. The data is noisy, inconsistent, and doesn't clearly support the Hawthorne narrative. Second, the experimental and control groups were not properly matched. There were uncontrolled differences that could explain the productivity variations. Third, in the relay assembly room, 2 of the original workers were actually replaced early on because their performance was too low. So were we measuring the Hawthorne effect or just a better selected group? Fourth, the studies ran during the Great Depression, when job insecurity was rampant. Workers may have increased output simply to keep their jobs. And some radical critics argue the whole concept reflects a capitalist bias, the assumption that workers naturally underperform and only improve under special attention. These critiques don't necessarily kill the Hawthorne effect, but they make the standard textbook story far harder to defend. So if the Hawthorne effect is real, even partially, how do we deal with it? Here are 4 evidence-based strategies. First, build trust over time. The longer participants are in a study, the more their behavior normalizes. Second, use unobtrusive measures whenever possible. Digital data, archival records, or observations that don't require a researcher in the room. Third, deliberately build in habituation periods. Collect data for a week or 2 before your real measurement begins and discard that early data. Fourth, where it's ethically justifiable, mask your study objectives so participants aren't consciously adjusting the specific behaviors you're interested in. None of these fully eliminates the Hawthorne effect, but together they can dramatically reduce its impact on your findings. Let me leave you with this. Nearly a century after those first lighting experiments in Chicago, the Hawthorne effect remains both a cautionary tale and a profound insight. As a cautionary tale, it reminds us that research is messy, that the stories we tell about data sometimes outrun the data itself, and that we must be willing to revisit and question even our most cherished findings. But as an insight, it tells us something deep about human nature, that attention is itself a motivator, that being seen changes how we behave, and that every observation is, in some small way, an intervention. Whether you're running a clinical trial, managing a team, or designing a user study, remember that the observer is never truly separate from the observed. Thank you.